Today's episode has very brief mentions of sexual assault and suicidal ideation. Please engage mindfully. If you need support, the numbers for crisis support will be linked in the description box. Hi, folks. Welcome back to Brown People Problems, to another episode where we're talking about courage and resilience. And for that conversation, we have Taniya Gupta joining us today. She is a local South Asian Indo-Canadian woman, and she's an author of What Will People Say? If you're listening on Spotify, you can't see this, but I'm currently holding up her book. I have her book here of her collection of poems, and we're going to be talking about courage and resilience from the lens of her stories today. So if you are not familiar with Taniya, she is a poet who grew up in Punjab, India, and she now lives in the suburbs of Toronto. She advocates for voice and mental health through her work. Her first book, What Will People Say, was published recently in January 2024 and is a collection of poems inspired not only by her own life, but also some of the women in her family and millions of others trapped in a patriarchal family structure. She was recently listed as one of Indigo's favorite Canadian poets, which I saw, which was so awesome. Congratulations. And she loves looking for moments of slowness throughout mindfulness and tea. You can read more about her work on her website, and her socials and her website are going to be linked down in the show notes as always. So, you know what? Grab a nice cup of tea. Tanya recommended that I grab something with ginger. So that's what I have today, my like little honey ginger tea. And we're going to chat about resilience and courage. Welcome to the podcast, Tanya.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be chatting with you today. I've been listening to some episodes in preparation for this, and I love the work that you're doing. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind. I'm so excited for our conversation. I know when I just saw you, I think on Instagram, because yeah, everything is so recent, right? The time of recording this, it's April 2024, and your book just came out a handful of months ago. And when I saw on Instagram, it like immediately stood out to me and spoke to me. And so I knew I had to get my hands on it and message you. And now I have been seeing you everywhere on my Instagram. So that's awesome. And to be in a major bookstore, that's a huge feat. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I so appreciate that. I love the fact that this journey is helping me connect with more of my own community. So I am very happy.
Yeah. Isn't it such a gratifying process?
100%.
Yeah.
It's a long process. It's a tough process, but it's definitely gratifying when you get to meet people and hear their stories and kind of like share yours and find those points of connection, find those points of like getting over the fear and whatnot that we go through as women, as immigrants, as people of color.
Yeah, I'm curious if you can share a little bit more about your journey as an author and what sort of inspired you to write poetry, decide to like publish a book? Because I mean, I'm sure it was a long process. I'm curious
Yeah,
about
we can talk about that for hours.
that.
So I will tell you that poetry kind of chose me. I was very little. I was maybe like 5, 6 years old. That's my earliest memory of just writing. And a lot of times, even now, words just come and I just have to like write them. And as romanticized and cliche as that sounds, a lot of times it is that way. And I think being a kid who wasn't very I was indoors a lot more than I was outdoors,
Mm.
at least like in my free time. So I feel like I just became that person who's like always observing the world around me, and that kind of the output of that is poems, a lot of times. So I've been writing since I was, again, like very little. My mom now tells me that I used to fill pages and pages, and she's like, I had no idea what you were writing, but I guess I should have put two and two together. So
Wow.
yeah, I think like that's kind of my poet journey with poetry. I don't know if like then I knew that I would collect these poems and put them into a book. I think that's just been something I started a blog a few years ago, and some friends would read. I would publish once a month, and some friends would read and say, You should maybe, like, there was one particular friend who was like, you should try and publish a book. And I was like, that sounds like a crazy idea. I don't think, it just sounded so far-fetched. Not that publishing a book wasn't attractive to me or like wasn't something I wanted to do, but it just sounded so far-fetched. Like, how does that even happen? How do you take
Mhm.
something that's in your journals and now put that into a book? So, yeah, I think it's like I said, we can talk about this for hours, but it's been quite the process of getting from these poems on papers in my journals and then now into a book.
Mm,
But the one story that I would say is very relevant, like after I had decided that I want to write a book or like collect some of my poems and put them together into a book, I actually went in through the lowest point that I've been in my life.
oh,
And during that, I remember this one day, it was April, it was poetry month. I did not realize it was poetry month because I was so low
mm,
that I didn't know what time of the day it was, what time of the year it was. And I remember one day I had Rupi's Sun and Her Flowers on my phone.
mm,
And I decided one evening that I was going to sit and read every word of that book, cover to cover, out
mm,
loud to myself. Because if I was just reading it, there was so much noise in my head, I couldn't register what I was reading. So I
mm,
read every word of that book out loud to me. And I think that gave me so much courage that like I could get myself out of that very, very, very dark place.
mm,
So I feel that that was a moment in my life where it was very clear to me that yes, I'd already decided I want to write a book of poems, but this is why I really, really want to do it because
mm,
poetry got me out of a very dark place. And if I and my story and the stories of women in my family can help other people feel less lonely and get out of those like places of shame or fear, then I've
mm,
done my work in life. So long answer to your question, but
mm.
that's a little bit about my journey.
No, it's nice. We like long answers here. I think, as you were sharing that, I was really just reminded of how books are like such great friends and they can be so therapeutic as well, right? Like so many people have found so much comfort in books. Like for me, it's very, very cliche, but that's for me, that's the Harry Potter series. Anytime I'm in a crappy place in my life, I will just pick up one of the Harry Potters and just flip to any page and just go from there. And for you, it was Sun and Flowers. And for somebody else, it could be something else, but there's so much comfort to be found in books and especially in poetry too. And there were times when I was reading a couple of your poems and I found that sense of comfort as well. There was one while I was reading where I particularly had like goosebumps. I was like, oh my gosh, this is really speaking to me. Okay, I need to really reflect on this.
I'm
And that's such a beautiful relationship to have.
curious to know which poem it was.
Oh gosh. Okay, let me tell you. So well, a lot of them really spoke to me, but the one that really like spoke to me was in page 100. It's one of your last ones. It's called My Roots.
Mm,
And so I've also made like little notes in some places in the book, but I thought it did like you did such a good job here of reclaiming your relationship with your cultural heritage and your roots, right? Because throughout, there have been some times in the book where you have spoken about how in your cultural journey, like you've felt like pulled between two extremes and, felt tempted to abandon like your cultural heritage, like we all have as
mm.
immigrants or as children of immigrants. And I just like loved how you just compiled everything in that. And, especially when you said that it took you so long to realize that your roots were your strength, that they stayed with you no matter how far you went. And oh, I love that.
I'm glad this we spoke to you. I was rereading this a few days ago because I was having this conversation with someone, right? And we were just talking about how when you first move, like I moved when I was a teenager from
Mm.
India to Canada, and
Yep.
when you first move, there's just like so much of that pull towards being cool, like the majority of the people you see around, and that's unfortunately, around me, it wasn't people of color. It was, you know, the white kids, and you want to be like them, you want to dress like them, and whatnot, and You don't want your clothes to smell of curry, or like, so I feel like even though I was very mindful throughout that, I don't want to abandon my culture, because also your cousins back home, they'll tease you. You,
Yeah.
if um you aren't quote unquote cultured enough. So it was such a struggle for so many years, but I feel like I'm getting to a place, or I am at a place, and hope, and I'm sure this is going to be a journey where,
Mhm.
this is who I am. I want to embrace my culture, because like this is what has shaped me, right? And I'm sure like you relate to that as well. So yeah, that's kind of where this piece stems from.
Yeah, absolutely. I immigrated to Canada as well when I just turned 13. Okay, so this is a long time ago. And my experience, absolutely exactly what you said. It was all just like white kids, and I felt so much pressure to gel with folks. I thought I was ready because I grew up watching a lot of I don't know if you remember this show, like a lot of like I Dream of Jeannie, Small Wonder, right? A lot of these like
Mm, mm,
Eurocentric shows. I remember watching them. And I was like, and I grew up watching so much Nickelodeon with my cousins. So I was like, I had some idea of, just the pop culture in general, but oh my gosh, it was a total whiplash
yeah.
coming here at such an early age. And you do feel tempted to leave so many parts of you behind. And for some folks, in our community, that's still the case.
Mm,
Because it took me, and it sounds like it even took you a long time to get to this place where you're like, okay, I relish the parts of my cultural heritage, right? That I had previously just like shoved aside, and reclaiming it. It takes time and it takes courage.
yeah. Yeah. No, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad
Uh,
this piece spoke to you though.
Yeah, it did. I loved this piece. And, that also made me wonder, well, not just that piece, but the entire time when I was reading your book, especially like earlier on in the first half, there was a lot of vulnerability in here. And I am just so curious of putting your work out there in the world in any format
Hmm.
is an act of courage and requires a lot of vulnerability. I'm curious what that process was like for you to really just show so much vulnerability through some of these poems and have others read them. Did that feel tough, or was that more of um, a comfortable process for you?
Um, it was a mix of both.
Mhm.
I think one thing I was realizing as I was healing, that the more stories I kept to myself, the more fear had power over me, and the more shame had power over me. The more I would share with someone, even just something as simple as like, um, when I first moved here, I couldn't understand the accent, even though English is something I learned to write and read before even Hindi, right? Like I
Mhm.
learned to speak Punjabi and Hindi, but like writing came after.
Mhm.
Lower kindergarten, upper kindergarten was English only, and then in grade one they started Hindi and Punjabi. So, even sharing something as simple as that, because somehow what we don't realize, or like when I hadn't seen a single picture of Canada when I moved here, right? Like I just kind of like packed my
Mhm.
bags and here I am. So I feel like similar to that journey, which was like a mix of a lot of discomfort, a lot of like, why am I doing this? Same thing with this, a lot of um courage, but also a lot of like fear. Is this okay to put my story out there? Because once it's out there, it's out there. But I think, like I was saying to you, one thing I've realized is that the more I was sharing with people, even little bits of my journey, the less power those stories had over me, the less I would
Mhm.
feel like I had to keep hiding. So I think that gave me a lot of courage, to speak up and to put these stories out there. Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, there's, this really famous kind of saying in our line of work, which is that shame loves isolation,
Mm,
right?
110%.
Yeah, and there's Brene Brown. She talks a lot about if you put shame in a petri dish, right? It's gonna just grow and grow and grow, and it's gonna create more fear and isolation. But when you start speaking your story, you start speaking your vulnerability, the shame shrinks,
Hmm.
right? And the fear shrinks. And it sounds like that has been your experience firsthand.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like I was over 25 years old the first time I told one of my closest friends
Mm,
about some of the sexual assault stuff that I had gone through. And she was shocked. She's like, how come you've never said this to me? I could have supported you through some of it. And I was like, it was too shameful.
mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't have another answer for it, right? And now I'm very much okay to share that with others because I know there are more people out there than we know of or than that we think of who've been through similar experiences. So yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Which makes me curious too, as you published your work, your poems, and they came out into the world, what was the response like from your family and friends? Was there, I'm sure a lot of it was probably like very supportive and very celebratory, but I'm curious, were there any surprises about some of the poems in here?
Um, so same thing with the response. I think some people have been very supportive and very um I think there's also been a little bit of like disbelief that
Mm,
oh my God, like you actually went because I remember one of my friends saying, who even publishes books anymore? Because it's such a mysterious world, right? Especially for a person of color to navigate. Like, unfortunately, that it's still a difficult process to go through, and it's changing. It's changing with time. So I think some of the reactions were of disbelief.
mm,
Some family and friends have been very, very supportive. One friend was like, "This is your love letter to yourself," and I was
mm,
yeah, that's one way of looking at it. And then there are some people and some friends, and this is something I'm glad you asked that question because this is something I've also been thinking of that there have been some people who I thought would be more supportive and more
mm,
um just appreciative of the fact that, you know what, you're speaking your truth. But it's not been the case. They've barely been there and or there's been this like almost feeling of jealousy. So it's been interesting to also go through that because when you think of let's just call it a dream, you kind of like think of your family and friends as well, and you think, this is how this person will react, and your brain builds it up, right? And then when things actually are happening, it's very different. Reality is very different than what you had imagined, and that sometimes actually like makes you go down a spiral where it's like, why didn't this person
mm,
message me or why didn't this person show up to this event? So yeah, that I feel like that journey has been a whole thing in its own, just to like see
mm,
who's supportive, who's showing up. And I remember having a conversation with one of my friends who's very, very close to me. And she said, she's like, it's not that I don't want to support you. It's just really difficult for me to read some of these poems and know a friend of mine went through this. That's
mm.
also a fair point, right? So yeah, I'm just observing
Yeah.
yeah, what people's reactions are.
Yeah, no, that is such a good point, right? That there can be some envy, perhaps, right? And I think that's a lot of that is part of perhaps like of like our cultural trauma around comparison. But then, yeah, it could also just be people's own discomfort,
Hmm.
right? But I'm glad to hear that largely it has been a very supportive experience because I imagine that's exactly what you would need, like publishing vulnerable work like this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm glad to have the people who I have in my corner. I think that's, it's really important. Like you said, when doing something like this, when publishing a piece of work that's very raw, very honest, very vulnerable, and in the hope that like it helps us all break some of those generational patterns, right? Because
Mhm.
saw it happened to Nani, saw it happen to mom, and we have to stop.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Which, you know, makes me wonder, one of the biggest themes in the book is like the patriarchal cultural structure, gender discrimination that stems from patriarchy. And I do think a lot about that in the context of our, you know, cultural traumas. We inherit a lot of traumatic stuff from our cultures of origin. Um, But, if we're going to talk about the cultural trauma or the generational trauma, it also only makes sense to talk about generational healing and cultural healing and resiliency. And I am curious, is there anything from whether it's like the larger like Daisy culture or perhaps like your micro family culture that has felt like it's contributed to your resilience?
Absolutely. You know, when I was saying to you that poetry kind of picked me, I didn't go looking for it necessarily. I feel like that's part of my ancestral resilience and healing. Like it's, at times there's one poem in the book that kind of goes, it's another night, years and years later. And I'm
Mm,
still that little girl, terrified.
mm,
That poem, I wrote it at 3 a.m. Nikita, if you ask me exactly how the poem structured itself. I didn't structure it.
mm,
That's part of like I feel like that's part of my ancestors talking through me, right? I'm just doing the work. They're putting these stories out there through me. So 100%. I take no credit for
mm,
this resilience that I have. The one thing I can do is I can be in a place where I can listen to what they're trying to tell me or what they're trying to say
mm.
through me. But it's 100% um, resilience of the women before me. Like I very much feel that. I very much believe that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because yeah, you have been shedding light to experiences of just women generally in the larger culture and their trauma. But yeah, they're also like their resilience of voicing, right, their trauma or finding ways to process it and to work through it. And when you said you felt called to poetry, like how adaptive to take all of these feelings inside and start writing them, right? Like, what an adaptive practice, what a resilient practice to say, okay, I'm carrying so much inside of me. I need to start putting pen to paper, right? Starting to form words, starting to form poems with that. That is so resilient of us, right? As a cultural group, I think we often show like our resiliency through cooking, expressive arts, right?
Yeah,
Some of our love languages,
yeah,
through dance.
yeah. That's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what your story like strikes me as so such an adaptive practice to put that pen to paper and start forming like your thoughts into poems.
And it's very healing, right? Like whichever process you pick, whichever art form speaks to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like for my mom, I feel like when she's crocheting, she's in that meditative state. She's in that like, connected state. Or when sometimes when she's cooking, usually she's rushing. So I
Mm-hmm.
think like for me that's poems, that's poetry, that's just putting pen to paper and like even if I'm journaling, it's very healing, it's very freeing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there is another side of what will people say? So, this phrase, what will people say, carries a lot of just like trauma, right? Around comparison and pleasing everybody. Do you think there's a resilient side to this phrase as well?
I think so. I don't know if I would say particularly this phrase, right? But there is definitely a very resilient side to our culture, right? Like
Oh.
if you look at what we went through for years and years during colonization, what we've gone through even as like women coming from those cultures and just because of colonization, the impacts it had on our overall society, and then being women who were kind of not even treated as equals. I think
Mm,
there's definitely a very resilient side to our culture. And now when I look at like you and I both live in the Greater Toronto area, right? So many people who move here who just uproot themselves and show up here. We don't understand the language half the times. We don't understand the food. I didn't understand the language or the food. For the first 2 weeks, I was on like a strawberry milk and fruits diet because I
mm,
would go to the cafeteria and ask for vegetarian food and I would get bacon, right?
mm,
Put in my sandwich and whatnot. So my point is like these are smaller pieces of that resilience, but being able to say that like I'm just gonna pick up my bags and go move to this whole other country, like now with social media, we still have exposure, but years ago, we didn't understand a lot what
Mm,
we do understand now. So I think there
mm,
is a big like piece, or we are as a society very, very resilient. And
mhm,
I think like these chances that we take with our lives, with, just like uprooting ourselves, or like putting our stories out there, or creating space for ourselves in places that are still very white dominated. I think that's all part of that like resilient
mhm.
weave, right?
Yeah, I love how you said that because there is a lot of stress and difficulty and potentially trauma in immigration, but there's so much resilience in that as well. My parents, they were in their early 40s where they just dropped everything and they decided to move halfway across the world. That, as I reflect on it now as a 30-something-year-old adult, it just blows my mind at the type of resiliency and adaptability that takes. And then to come here and then to work whatever job is thrown your way. How
Exactly.
adaptable, are we as a group? And this sense of like adaptation, it creates so much more resiliency, right, within us.
Oh yeah. 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 And just even, for your parents, like having children and being like, we're gonna make it work, but we're also gonna make it work for them. Like that's resilience. That's courage.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think often it's this pressure too of, what will people say that also drives a lot of this resiliency, perhaps, of, like, okay, we gotta have our, shit together. What are people gonna say if we don't? So I wonder if, we can see it in positive light
That's
too.
that's
But
a good point. That's a good point. Maybe I'll get there.
social comparison can sometimes be inspiring, but yeah, I think the cost versus benefits, I think the costs still take over the benefits for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I reflect a lot about just like your title of your book was so apt. Like, what will people say, right? Like that log kya kahenge, like we grew up hearing that all the time, and it is so embedded in us. I will find myself just thinking about if I have to go to an event and I think about, okay, what do I need to wear? I won't even realize that it's so much in my subconscious that it will come up for
Yeah.
me, and I have to actively unlearn that and catch myself in it and be like, okay, doesn't matter. People are gonna say what they're gonna say. It's okay. But it's like so drilled into us.
Oh, so much so, right? And like the amount of pressure we put on ourselves for like every little thing. I was listening to someone yesterday, a podcast, and the person was like, if you spend 15 minutes in the morning picking out your outfit, you do realize you've just spent 15 minutes of your energy in the morning, when energy is already very like, you
Mm,
know, um, you're just waking up, and you need to preserve that energy. And I was like, that is true. I mean, like I like dressing up, right? So I
mm,
I do understand where he's coming from, but if what's driving you is I need to dress up for others, maybe like I need to check on that. But if I'm dressing up because it makes me happy, great, I can spend my energy however I want. But yeah, to your point, it is so drilled into us, right? Like even like I remember, like I would be like, can I have this in my tiffin? And I would be like, but what are your friends gonna think, that that's what you want to eat for? I
mm.
just, it's like those little things that um why do we need to look at everything through the lens of what society is going to say? Because the reality is, like someone said this to me at my wedding, they're like, people are going to say what they're going to say, just enjoy your moment, like do
Yeah,
your thing. um
absolutely.
so yeah.
Yeah, and so much of it has like its roots, like you were saying, in colonialism, right? Because this fear of being ostracized from the community comes from being in survival mode for hundreds and hundreds of years. If
Yeah.
your survival feels endangered, one of the ways to survive is in a group, right? And then you are worried about how is the group going to accept or reject you. But like you're saying, now it's seeping into these so many tiny, tiny spaces where it's creating so much pressure and stress in our lives. And it creates a lot of inauthenticity. And I also saw that in some of the themes in your work as well, where you're kind of fighting between being authentic versus fitting in or striving for approval.
Yeah. That like struggle for approval or validation is just so, it's so real. Like I remember I used to socialize so much until a few years ago because I moved here on my own and as a teenager, right? I didn't have any family or friends. And that need for approval was so real that I would just go to this party and hop to that one. And I exhausted myself. And that's not who I am underneath as a being, like I can't socialize that much. It drains me out. So last few years I've just been learning like what works for me. Like, what am I what is going to keep my batteries charged or drain them to the point where I can recharge them fairly quickly versus what's going to just like drain me completely and it takes me weeks to recover.
Mm,
But yeah, like you said, a lot of that stems from first colonialism. Then as immigrants, you want to show yourself as like, I've made it, right? Like I didn't fail at this
mm,
because guess what? There are tons of people waiting back home to see you fail.
mm.
So yeah,
Yeah, oh my
yeah.
gosh. What you just said, side note, reminds me of this new Shah Rukh Khan movie that I watched, Donkey.
Oh
And
yeah.
oh my gosh, that was so good. But yeah, absolutely. Like there's so much pressure to succeed too, right? With immigration, that creates a lot of shame and guilt if you are don't succeed. And then you're like, okay, like how can I go back?
Yeah, and to send photos that are just like,
Oh
picture
my
perfect.
gosh.
And
Yeah.
sorry, I feel like we went on a whole other tangent here, which is
No,
a
it's fine.
whole conversation in itself. But yeah, there's so many um layers to what will people say. Like it's it starts at a very small level, but then it's just so big. And families have been ruined over what will people say, right? Like people, instead of realizing that, what, this is hurting my parent or this is hurting my kid, it's more, we need to continue doing this because I need to keep that status or that, like, whatever, keep my ego strong in that social setting. And I think that was the point of me writing this book, that like
Mhm.
we have to realize that has to stop. Because at the end of the day, like, look, when the pandemic hit, it was our own families that were like close
Mhm.
to us, or like very few friends. So we need to look after each other, at least our immediate families, beyond that guilt of like what that auntie's gonna say or what that friend's gonna
Mhm.
say. So yeah.
Absolutely, I love that. And on that note, do we get which one is your favorite poem? And I know that's a very weird question, probably not a fair one either, but is there one that really stands out to you? And is there one that you would like to speak for us today?
Sure. So, like you already pointed out, it's difficult to pick one. But there is one that was one of the last ones I actually wrote for the book. I will say, you know, trigger warning for anybody listening, suicide ideation here, but this is page 91, and it's one of my absolute favorite pieces.
Hmm.
And it kind of like fits really well into our theme for today of like resilience and courage. Um,
Hmm.
so this piece is called We're All Afraid of Dying. The other day, someone asked me, what's your biggest fear in life? I'm wondering what a person like me can be afraid of after coming so close to taking my own life, not once, but twice. Staring in the mirror and not recognizing the person standing on the other side, looking down from the terrace above a 12th floor apartment, not knowing what to do with this ghost of a girl living inside my body. So, to answer the question, my biggest fear is losing myself again.
Hmm. Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, this piece was also very, very powerful. I remember reading this and I had to kind of just take a couple minutes to then like process after, but oh, so raw. I love it. Thank you so much for reading that for us.
Thank you for asking me. That's one of the last pieces I put in, and uh, I debated for a bit because, like I said, there is, it can be triggering for someone, but again, that hope, that resilience, that courage, I hope is what sticks.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh. So I recognize that your books are available on Indigo, which is sort of the national retailer, right? In Canada, it's like our Barnes and Nobles.
Mhm.
Where else can folks purchase your books?
So Indigo definitely, and Amazon also has my book. If you have a favorite local bookstore, you can request them to stock a few copies. I would really appreciate that because then my book can be in in these stores. I'm also at events around GTA for the next few months. I will have signed copies there as well. So stay connected on socials and you can come and grab a signed copy.
Yeah, that's awesome. If we meet for coffee, can you sign my copy?
Of course.
Awesome. I would love that. Oh, thank you so much for coming on here. I really wish we had more time today, but I'm looking forward to connecting more and collaborating more. Folks, if you haven't checked out Taniya's like socials, her book, What Will People Say, everything is going to be in the show notes for you below. If you are on YouTube watching us here, the comment section is here for your exploration. If you're on Spotify, there is a Q&A section as well down below, so feel free to engage. And if you have any thoughts, you can always email me as well, which is also going to be in the show notes below. Thanks so much for taking time out and joining me for this conversation, Taniya.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great. I hope we have many more conversations.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, folks, stay tuned for our disclaimer. The guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.